Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Heart of New York show. This is part two with my good friend Maestro, Joseph Lento. He's involved, I call him now, from now on, I'm going to call him the modern day Welcome Back Carter. He's gifted in so many areas, not only the trumpet, but I mean, what he does for the school system and what he does with students is like we could create another TV show. Just to let you know again and keep you informed that Joseph is licensed by the New York State as a school district administrator and as a teacher of orchestral music grades K through 12. In 1999, Joseph was named Lehman High School Teacher of the Year and New York City Department of Education, Bronx County High Schools Teacher of the Year. In 2014, President Barack Obama named Joseph a National Teacher of Arts and Humanities. 2017, United States Senator Kristen Gillibrand proclaimed by letter Joseph a maestro and cited his work as a model for all New York State. United States Senator Majority Leader Charles Schumer also cited by letter Joseph's work in education since 1984 as exemplary. Joseph also received letters of commendation for excellence from President Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and George Walker Bush. And this September, Joseph is launching his online magazine. Edessential? Edessential, okay, sorry about that. Education Magazine. Presently, Joseph is teaching music and introduction to a psychology at the prestigious Maria Regina High School in Hartsdale, New York. Welcome back, brother.
Thank you.
Good to have you back again.
You're very kind.
We
Thank you.
have a very, very full show, and I want to get right into these questions that I have for the maestro, so we don't lose a minute. Please pay attention because you're going to find this absolutely extremely informative right now, and you'll be well pleased. Joseph, like many things we see in our society, people are unfamiliar with how they begin and who to begin with. I'd like to start by asking whose idea was it to formalize education?
Well, again, thank you for having me here. Today, we're going to be talking about the formalization of education in what is now the United States. To discuss the entire world right now, we simply don't have the time. So we're going to focus on our school system. Sometime shortly after the first settlers came here, they opened up the first school in Boston called the Boys Latin School. I believe it was 1635. And it was a school that, of course, only boys attended. But it was actually publicly funded. It was the first also introduction to taxpayer-funded schools. The idea of schooling was very important to the settlers. They wanted to make sure that it was available, at least, of course, to these children in their communities. Probably by 1650 or something around there, they were already formally collecting taxes and so on for school, which is fascinating because most people are not sure when this whole idea of taxpayer-funded schools came to be and the model which we use. But it's really a very old model. It's not new. It's an old concept.
But what you just said is it was an all-boys school. This is in the 1600s, right?
1635.
Publicly funded.
Yeah.
And it was all boys. So what? How'd they decide then? Just my own curiosity, when girls can be allowed in the school?
There isn't a specific date on that. If there is, somebody who's a real scholar in this would know. But actually, girls began to be educated not too long after the boys' school opened up. In the 17th century and 18th century, girls were beginning to receive education. Interestingly enough, though, a lot of girls, they were taught to read, but not write. I'm not sure you can do one without the other. But girls were also involved in that. But Peter, essentially, when schools first started, they were really basically about religion and morality and things of that nature. But there is something called the, I believe it's the New England Primer, which was a very basic outline of what children should know, basic computation and so on. So there was a little formalized curriculum, but it's still really centered around religion, morality, and very specific roles, men doing this, women doing that. It was what the times were.
That's what,
It was what the times were.
that's right. Now, today, we have school taxes to support education. But how, I'm like a history buff, how was it paid for before? How did they get their money?
Basically, there's always been tax collectors. I mean, we can just go back as far in history as you want, tax collectors in the Bible, right?
That's right.
Sure. So there's always been tax collectors.
Zacchaeus.
Always been tax collectors. That's never been a problem. People, who run things know how to collect the money to run them. So that's always been the case. But people willingly, they wanted their children to have an education. So it was something they were willing to do. And they kind of set the model for what we are using, today.
Now, in modern times, every child has to go to school. Was this always the way it was?
No, not at all. But children have had to go to school. Today, we have something called compulsory education laws, which means every child has to go to school. And they're not as new as we think they are. In the 1800s, the first tries at compulsory education, 1860s, 1870s, probably after the Civil War, where the government said, look, if you're a child between, I think it started out between the ages of 8 and 12, 8 and 14, something along those lines, you should go to school. You have to know how to read, you have to know how to write, you should know basic math, because they understood, you need a population that can articulate things to each other. Whether you're in sales, whatever you're doing, you need to know, there needs to be a baseline of education so we can all communicate, understand, commerce and the like. But it was probably maybe 1880 or so where, especially in New York, the compulsory education laws really kicked in, and they really began to formalize making it necessary for children to go to school. And people would be notified, they had to go, they had to attend, and they had to contribute.
Oh,
So unfortunately, people who couldn't contribute often left some other people out.
Right.
But this taxation system that we developed began to bring everybody in. Interesting, Peter, you had asked me a question earlier, and I'm just remembering it now. Actually, it was late 1700s where the first taxes were collected by colonies, formerly when we became the United States after colonial rule under the Washington administration. Such an interesting subject. I cannot get my hands on enough things to read about it.
I can't help when you're saying that children were basically required to go to school. I don't even know if they still have them today, but do they still have truant officers? Like right out of the Little Rascals, you remember that?
Peter, right up through the 1980s, and I know because I worked in a lot of schools, they still had truant officers.
No kidding.
Yeah, they did. They were modern in terms of, they made phone calls. Sometimes they would show up to the house. But from the 1900s on, beginning of the 20th century, the New York City especially was a thriving place, lots of people and lots of immigrants, and they wanted to be educated. And we wanted to make sure that the people were being educated, because we want education, produces a good society. We want everyone to be able to speak and communicate and succeed. So they were very serious about getting kids to school. Excuse me, I heard, stories from my grandparents about truant officers coming to the door.
Right.
Absolutely. But by that time, the majority of the states, by the beginning of the 20th century, had compulsory education laws. Students had to go to school, and the tax base was now bigger, because, we'd already, was still in the throes of the second industrial revolution. So, there was money coming in, and those who couldn't afford didn't have to pay because there was a larger tax base. They worked, they paid what they could afford, just like it is today, but everybody gets the same treatment. Remember, in another show, we talked about the 10th and the 14th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is about states having freedom and so on, and, they can do what the federal government doesn't provide, but the 14th Amendment says, well, it has to all be equal. So as far back as then, beginning of the 20th century, education had to be equal. Whatever education was, had to be open and equal to all the students in the states that had compulsory education, which was the majority of the states.
And that was always the case?
From that point on,
From
yeah,
that point
sure.
on?
Yeah.
Now, at every grade level, students are taught certain topics that change and advances each year. Was this always the case?
There used to be something called, and we would have seen it on shows like Little House on the Prairie or what have you. The Little Red Schoolhouse, where you had students of all ages being taught different things at the same time. But no, years and years ago, people have always observed behavior, and people observed the behavior of children and noticed, and we all noticed this, at certain ages, there are milestones that children achieve, walking, crawling, speaking, it's, with all within a certain construct, framework. So people understood that at certain ages, students could digest information. So when they understood, okay, at age 5, a child can digest this much. At age 10, they can internalize that much. So it's really been a plan over the years. It was never always formal, not in the sense that we have it today. There were societies that, of course, did have very formalized instruction, but that was more for a few rather than the many. So there's always been this idea of, I'll use this term again, scaffolding, building upon. Grade 1, we understand there's enough information. Students can internalize X amount of information. Grade 2, they can internalize X amount of information, and it goes on and on like that. So since the 20th century, here in the United States, and I'm only speaking for our country right now, that idea of grades has been very, very structured. There's no more old schoolhouse, where, well, that's not always true, but please.
I remember in junior high school, where they call it intermediate school today, that they would have different levels of classes, depending on, I don't know if you use this term, how smart the student is, but they had one particular class that were for the very, very smart. There was a group in there, and then it went down to, I don't even know how they did it, but how did they do that? How did they determine, based on their reading levels?
Based on math and reading scores. Remember at another time we were talking about exams.
Right.
And so now I happen to not be a firm believer in that foundation at all, in terms of just pure math and reading determines intelligence. Because we've seen that, people with incredibly high IQs and tremendous talent might not always do well on a particular test. But overall, what they did was, and a lot of people thought it was good, and it did have its good points. Not everything is always all one or the other. They would take that same standard of curriculum that's passed down from the state, but they would teach it a little differently. So if you were in 8 SPE1, that we used to call it special education classes. Now, I was in those classes going through school. So we would always be very challenged with math and reading and so on. but we were all still in the same grade. We all still learned the
Right.
same outline of things, but there was the opportunity for a little bit more if you could.
Like a language, like Spanish.
Yeah, if you were, something you were inclined to, it was available to you. Over the years, that's changed. We've come to what's called an inclusion model, where students of all differing math and reading scores are placed together, and the differentiated instruction takes place. So the teacher has to teach to the many different levels of student, what students are acclimated for. So if they're all taking, my class, and if I were teaching a class on Beethoven, right, I would and have to adjust for all the different learning in my classroom, which is something I love doing, and I've been doing it forever. Adjusting what I'm saying. Look, some people like to look at the picture to put the model together. Some people want the instructions. Some people, just tell me what to do. So we deal with those things more now, hopefully, to bring more people together. I think it's a wonderful idea, because then,
But let's face it, I don't mean to cut you off,
No.
but there are some groups that are smarter than others. And you can't keep them together because it's bringing back memories of and I don't know if it's being done today. That's why I'm asking you. But back then, you had a special high reading level, math level class that had more things, that had the extra language than we did on the ones that had a lower reading level.
well, there still are advanced placement courses. So students who want to take advanced placement history, they can take it. These courses are available.
It's fascinating because one particular person that I can remember years ago, that he just couldn't stop reading. He was like so smart. A teacher would come out with a question, for instance, what does CIA mean? Central Intelligence Agency. I mean, of course, everyone
Yeah.
knows that, but when you're a little kid, you don't know it. But he just knew everything. And on the city bus on the way home, he would be reading, and that's the way it is. But and he couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah. Having a class filled with people who all learn differently, I think is fascinating from a teacher's point of view. I think it's very exciting, to
So
tell
do
you the
I.
truth.
Yeah.
And when you have the support of your administration and so on to work in that way, where this particular student needs to be taught this way, this particular student needs to be taught that way, and they can all do it in the same classroom. Is it difficult? If you look at it as being difficult, but if it's something you don't look at as being difficult, and you love it, you can do it. It's not for everyone, by the way.
Is it being done today?
I think teachers are doing it everywhere they possibly can.
Okay.
And when they can do it. There's no doubt in my mind. And some people focus a little bit more on it than others, just like with anything else, And as teachers, we all have strong suits. Everyone's stronger at something, but I love when kids learn differently, because it keeps me excited, it keeps me thinking about things, and I'm getting information to students, And by the way, when we talk about the old schoolhouse, that's what was going on way back then. People were teaching people. The teacher was differentiating instruction all day long.
When I was in junior high, and I'm saying to myself, well, why can't I get in that class, that number one class? And then, of course, it was because I think they were doing based on reading levels. But do you know that I didn't find out till I met my wife, Angela, that I had dyslexia, and I went and got tested for it. And I didn't even know I had that.
Yeah. And by the way, what you bring up is very important. We talked about it, there are issues that are undiagnosed. We're very good at that today in education. And, by the way, if you think your child or relative or friend has a learning challenge, just ask your school district to give them an evaluation. If you attend a private school, you can still get that. Your local school district will provide you with the testing and all. So, the public services are also available to students in private schools.
So if the parents feel that there's some type of difficulty in an area with their children, they can present that to the school.
To the school.
And they can try and figure out exactly what it is, like dyslexia, they can,
Sure, and what'll happen is, public or private school, the school district, and all schools, public or private, although private has more latitude in terms of testing and so on, they do a wonderful job. They can get these services, they can get these tests, and it's part of the public school system that you'll get the tests through. So if you have any issues, go to your local school district and say you'd like an evaluation for your child. You'll get one. You should do it.
Excellent, excellent.
It should happen.
We hear about the term educational philosophy. What does that mean?
That's important. There are different philosophies of everything, right? Basically, it's how we go about something. Some people believe in whatever they believe in, others believe in what they believe in. In education, we have perennialism, essentialism, there is progressivism and reconstructivism or reconstructionism. And those are basically like four schools of thought on how I think students should learn. And I think from every one of them, you can get something. I happen to fall, just in case you were interested, I'm more in the progressive area, and we'll talk about that.
What does that mean?
All right. I'm going to get to that
All
in a
right.
second. So a perennialist, they basically like information that is tried and true, more reluctant to new methods, methodologies, systems, more rigid, sometimes almost to a point where they don't want to really hear any other information. No, you teach 1 + 1 this way and that's it. That works for some people. Some people it doesn't. That's a perennialist. That's very simplistic, by the way. They are educators who work in a specific frame and don't want to go out of that. That works for some, doesn't work for others. Perennialists. Essentialists are educators who want students to have a very structured background, like perennialists in a way. But they're more focused on making sure the student is going to know A, B, and C, so when they come out, we know this student definitely knows this set of information, so they can be what they call productive. Now, every education philosophy wants a student to be productive. However, essentialists are progressive in the fact that they're open to new methods and ideas. They're open to new methods and ideas about teaching what they already teach. Perennialists are not. So essentialists, they're open to new ideas, very structured.
Well, that's what we need, right?
I have a foot in both
You do?
worlds.
Okay,
The essentialist
Right.
and the progressive.
all right.
Now, the progressive is, and I think it lines up with music really well. We like interaction, activity, learning through experiencing things, sensory, hearing, conversations. It's not just static information. We like the student to really take charge of what's going on, challenge them with their own learning, and trust. Teachers are charged with giving children an education. We take that very seriously. So people who are not comfortable with this approach, it's because they want to make sure that the children learn what the standard says, and because they have a responsibility. But you can do that if your personality and your mindset is progressive. You can do both. You can reach the standards, but we do it more with student involvement and student activity. Get the students involved. Have them teach the class. Ask them what they like in terms of if we're doing a particular subject. What would you like to do first? They may not know. They generally don't. But it's interesting to see where their minds go.
Wow, that's interesting.
You know?
You know, years ago, Joe, I remember that to become a teacher, and maybe not so long ago also, that it was a very difficult position to get into, a public school teacher. Now we're hearing there's a shortage.
Yeah.
Well, what goes with that?
Well, I have an old saying, everything boils down to physics, and the physics tends to do with what's actually going on behaviorally between people. When people are experiencing things in schools, in terms of what they come away with, personally or financially, it doesn't portend a good outcome. So I think we're seeing a result of a lot of challenging environments in which teachers aren't supported, and they simply look for other.
What do you mean by that they're not supported?
Well, there are certain things, if we go back to foundations, like a perennialist or an essentialist, they need
Right.
order. Sometimes there's not enough order going on, and people can't always function like that. So they want to go into situations, and I don't want to get into a whole bunch of psychology here with hierarchy
Or
of needs.
politics.
And no, hierarchy of needs and so on. But, teachers, like students, have a hierarchy of needs. If they're not being met, it's hard for them to work in those environments. So I hope there'll be a conversation about addressing that paradigm between the school environments and the teachers' needs to address this shortage. Which is important. It's very important. We don't have enough teachers. It's going to be a problem.
My goodness, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's
in the public schools that there's a shortage of teachers.
Yeah, there is. It's gotten progressively challenging. So hopefully they'll have the appropriate conversations to remedy that, because there's nothing better than being a teacher. Teaching is a fabulous career, and so I hope more teachers go into it.
Based on what you know, and I've got to ask this because I'm curious. Is there hope for New York State schools?
Well, I'm an optimistic guy, and by and large, Peter, the schools are doing beautifully. If we really look, they really are doing beautifully. Kids are succeeding. Is this always the case? No, it's never always been the case. It's just we hear about it more. Are there issues that need to be addressed? Yes. How they should be addressed is left for people with higher pay grades than mine to talk about. My job, as I've always seen it, is to instruct children, care for them, love them, give them the information they need, and do what I can do in my room without being involved in anything else.
You got it. Straight from the Maestro. We got hope out there. They're doing well. Keep your kids in school. I hope you got a lot from this today. I sure did. We're glad you were here today. We'll see you soon. God bless.
Thank you.